So, why don't we start with the basic stuff? Today, I'm talking to Jack Monck. Jack Monck is a bassist from England, and you actually started playing bass, if I understood correctly, sometime in the mid to late 60s, the 1960s.
Yes, I think it was about 67, 68. Some friends of mine had a blues band, and I was a sort of bedroom guitarist. I was a blues fan.
Yeah.
But, so they were definitely in my area, and they were very good friends of mine from Cambridge Tech.
Yeah. Where did you live? Was this in Cambridge, yeah?
Yeah, I was living about half an hour outside Cambridge, a little village called Elmdon, but I went to school in Cambridge, which was a bit of a trek, and then as soon as I got old enough to be in sixth form, I went to Cambridge Tech because I didn't want to be in school anymore.
Yeah,
and that was pretty good because there was much more freedom, and I met some good people there, including my friend and colleague Pip Pyle, the drummer.
Okay.
And
what were you doing at Tech? What kind of topic?
A-levels.
Yeah, okay.
A-levels.
Yeah.
Or not very successfully, unfortunately.
Okay.
I sort of, especially in the second year, all the wheels came off a bit on that side. And
so what year, more or less, what year was this? You say 67, 66, 67?
I think I was born in 50. I think I was... In fact, I must have gone to Tech maybe in 66 or 67. So, and I was there a couple of years. And during that time, I think, probably maybe it was 67.
I think what I'm trying to get to is I'm just trying to get a picture of how is it that you started playing guitar or bass or whatever it was that you started with. What inspired you to do it? And what was the kind of like the backdrop? Was there lots of people picking up guitars and starting to play in their bedrooms at that time? Was it the Beatles or,
Well, certainly the Beatles for me, I absolutely grew up with that music. When they sort of really started to come through, 62, 63, that was, so those early Beatles records are like, folk music to me. It's just sort of part of the...
And where was it, the radio?
Good question. I can't remember, Nick. I guess it was the radio. Plus, I think we probably, started buying 45s. And I was living out in the country. It was, I think the inspiration, I had some lessons on classical guitar for about a year with a very nice lady. And it was okay. It was after school. But... the focus was very much on reading and doing it sort of the proper way. And while I enjoyed it, I didn't I think I did it for a year. And that, what was, for me, was a bit of a game changer at that point was reading music. It didn't mean anything to me. So I tended to learn things by heart.
Yeah.
And that was kind of okay up to a point. And I know plenty of people these days who play entirely by ear and memory and can play some fantastic players, But in later life, as we may get onto, I got interested in music notation, especially...
Okay.
But at that time...
But was that enough of a seed for you to kind of like understand the basics of theory? That like little year of lessons.
I think it taught me. You learned stuff like tuning the guitar. It's kind of basic, but no, I don't think I really learned any theory at that point. It was just it was very much just what was in front of me on the instrument. But I think what it did do, I suppose, like anything, you're just having a guitar in your hand, you kind of becomes used, you get used to that.
So it was the guitar, it wasn't bass, it was guitar at that time?
It was six-string guitar. I think it must have been a cheap Spanish guitar, nylon strung.
Yeah.
And then that sort of finished. And I think when I was probably about 13, 14, I think it was I was maybe 12, 13 when I had that year of lessons, and then that finished, and I got myself a very cheap electric guitar, because what I was listening to was blues, really.
Okay.
You know, was really into Chicago blues.
So what's that?
Muddy Waters.
Yeah, I was going to say Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf.
Howlin' Wolf, absolutely. Otis Spann, and people, and then maybe people like the harmonica player Little Walter and Junior Wells.
Wow. Okay.
You know, these, and they were very identified with Chicago. I loved B.B. King as well. He wasn't from Chicago, but that was a bit more sort of, you know, uptown maybe, or sort of a bit more.
But how
glitzy.
did you get that music? I mean, so it was a radio or 45s, and what you took the 45 home, listened to it, dissected it.
Yeah, I think that the blues records tended not perhaps to be so much 45s, probably more LPs. I remember there was a series of Chicago blues records, I think, you know, 1 to 5 or something.
Yeah.
And they were quite. It was.
So so somebody compiled them. There was was it an American compilation? Or
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm afraid I can't remember, but it was quite a scholarly bit of work. I would say it was more sort of from the folkloric sort of, you know, it was like enthusiasts. It wasn't commercial music at all at that time. But it just, talking about it with you now reminds me, we used to go to this, well, there was a couple of record shops, and I'm, you know, people of my generation, born in 1950, you know, that's where you got your music, really. Obviously,
what was
radio.
it? Was it like a little booth?
Yeah, you had booths you could go into and listen stuff, absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, so I listened to the blues in that setting. But I remember in that booth listening to a Miles record, Miles Davis record, and kind of thinking, wow, this is really special, but not really understanding it, you know. I kind of was drawn to jazz, and I think, but although I kind of knew it was really cool, I didn't really understand it. And whereas blues is much more immediate, isn't it? It's really sort of visceral, and you know, you can identify what it's about and what the, you know.
But what was it? Was it the sound of it or the lyrics?
It was the authenticity for me. I was, you know, you really wanted. I think that's what I got from it, is that feeling that it was very real, you know, not polished, not produced, really, you know, in very minimally, you know, a bit like, I mean, in some ways, you know, some things never change, like putting 4 guys in a room together and setting some mics up is, you know, is the essence of sort of, you know, where records started, wasn't it, a bit?
Yeah.
And, you know, now obviously we've got many other ways of doing things, but, you know, say punk rock, I mean, that was very much on a get the guys in there, you know, set them up, press go and get it done, you know.
Yeah, I'm really trying to kind of like picture this. So like early 60s, you got the Beatlemania probably just starting around about that time, like 62, 63. You also got the Stones.
Yes.
When you say authentic, I mean, I think I'm going to piss a lot of people off when I say this, but if I had to like do a judgment call between who was more authentic at that time in terms of sound, I would have said that the Rolling Stones, they sounded like they really liked American blues music.
True.
And trying to play that kind of stuff. So were you a Beatles fan or a Rolling Stones fan?
Well, both, I have to say, but no, I loved them both. I mean, the Beatles were authentic in a way, because after all, that's how they recorded it. Was very just much 4 guys in a room, you know. And all right, you're right, the Stones, you could tell they'd really listened to the blues and studied it. And but the Beatles likewise, maybe more so with Motown, and you know, on their early records they did Motown covers, quite a few. And so, you know, it was a product of study and work, I would say, from them. And, you know, I think they had that authenticity in a different setting, because obviously they weren't exactly a boy band or a put-together band, but in another way they were, weren't they, you know? Yeah.
So, okay, again, I'm just trying to really feel this, like, early mid-60s thing.
It's a long time ago.
A long time ago. but I would imagine that this was like the first generation, maybe, in the United Kingdom where making music was a viable career or a job. You know, like that people were actually thinking about doing that as a job.
I don't think I necessarily thought of it as that in such. It would have been good if I had. I think I was too young and too, inexperienced to even think about a career ahead. I didn't really know where I was going with it. I think that certainly the Beatles were absolutely influential and pivotal to me, to sort of think that just ordinary guys who'd not come through music college, could write their own songs and perform them, and that people wanted to hear it. That was very influential for me.
Yeah, I think this is really what I was trying to get to, or try to understand. I can't imagine that at the beginning of the 50s, if you were like 14 or 15 at the beginning of the 50s, that there were so many people picking up guitars and playing in their bedroom. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I just totally got the backdrop of it wrong. But it's like something happened in that 10 years during the 50s that caused teenagers to start doing that much, much more.
I'm sure that's right. Although I think, I wasn't in the US in the 50s, but I would imagine the impact of, say, Elvis and Buddy Holly and Chuck Berry at that time would have been a bit more, it would have been a real... Well, I think it was the first time that the sort of music industry thought, hang on, teenagers is a big market for us. We can sell a lot of music to this sector, and that really sort of...
I don't know the answer to this myself, but do you think that at that time the Chicago blues was mainstream commercial music in the US?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Because, really...
So mainstream would have been Elvis, yeah?
Yeah, and it would have been Sinatra and Perry Como and, country and western, I guess.
How is it that you got to hear Chicago blues?
I think... I wasn't alone, Nick.
Okay.
At that time, I suppose the so-called British blues boom, where you had bands like John Mayall and Fleetwood Mac and Cream coming out, was a bit later, but only a bit later. I think Cream formed in 67, 68, 67.
So who was Cream at that time?
Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker. Yeah. So, I think there is a bit of, it's my generation that, and I think... With due respect, you were a bit young to be exposed to that. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So, what? You're playing guitar in your bedroom. How did you get from doing that to being in a band? And what was the first band?
Yeah. So
I am listening, but I've just got to check a couple of things. Just let me do a technology check to make sure that I'm actually recording and everything's going smoothly. Mm-hmm. Yes. So how did you get
going down?
How did you get to being in your first band?
Well, when I went to Cambridge Tech, I met my drummer friend Pit Pyle. He was playing in a blues group with his friends Steve Miller and Phil Miller, who were brothers. Steve was a piano player, Phil guitar, and they had a bass player. They had a guy, I think, doing a bit of singing, harmonica and bass, but they wanted someone just to play bass. So
I really don't want to interrupt, but Phil Miller's he's become a little bit of an icon, hasn't he? Kind of like
absolutely.
So can we just? If you know it, if not, I can look it up. Can you remember what his website is called? This memorial website.
Yes, philmillerlegacy.com, all one word. Well, okay. Phil Miller Legacy.
I won't interrupt you again. I just wanted to get that in there.
Absolutely, Phil has. Without being a never sort of as famous or selling the sort of volumes of records that, say, Pink Floyd did, but on a different level, a much more a cult level, I would say, part of so-called Canterbury scene. But, of course, at that time, that was unknown. We were just a blues band, and I joined because I liked the music really. And although I hadn't played bass, I played a bit of guitar.
Yeah.
And so I remember they lent me a bass. They had one.
Do you remember what it was?
I wish I could. It could have been a Hofner.
Start with the colour.
Red.
Okay.
Yeah. It was quite nice, and they lent it to me. And I remember sort of going away. I was away for a few weeks.
So, if it was a Hofner, was it one of these ones that looked like a big violin?
Well, it wasn't like the one I've got now, which is the copy of the McCartney bass, the Hofner violin bass.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't a violin bass.
No.
So I'm not sure whether it could have been anything. I can't remember.
Okay.
But I remember going away and practicing that, a very bluesy sort of, which is what we were playing, and then I think I probably did my first gig on bass probably within 6 to 8 weeks of picking one up.
What age?
So I think I would have been 17.
Okay. And the band was called?
The band was called, at that stage, Bruno's Blues Band.
Okay.
And which later changed, the name the band changed to, it was Steve Miller's Delivery, and then Carol Grimes and Delivery. Carol was a
Was it ever called just Delivery?
Yeah, I think
So this is a band that, like if people go online, they're going to find stuff
they
like
will,
this band.
and Carol Grimes and Delivery made a record that came out on B&G, I think it was, but it's absolutely, there's quite a lot of stuff on YouTube.
Do you think that you could just say a little bit about each of the players? You talked about Pip.
Sure.
Yeah. Just say who these people are.
Yeah, so Pip was really who I met at Cambridge Tech. Phil was also there, and I remember seeing him around, but Pip was very sort of... Anyway, we were very close in age, and in fact we shared a bed sit together for I think it was our second year at Cambridge Tech.
Yeah.
And he was, I would say, very clubbable and sort of...
Clubbable.
That's an old word, isn't it?
Yeah.
By which I mean sociable, I suppose.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And he's a wonderful drummer. He died sadly in 2006, having done a lot of different stuff. But at that stage, he was same age as me, 16, 17.
And was he also into the blues?
Very much so, yeah. We were all... That was really our meeting point, really, certainly musically. And he'd... Well, obviously, being young, he was inexperienced, but he'd had a few lessons. He'd had some lessons with a drummer called Buzz Green, I think, a jazz drummer. Yeah. And Steve Miller was the older brother. Wonderful. His specialism was really boogie-woogie piano. Yeah. Especially guys like Meadlux Lewis, guys like this, a very... And it was really, and it's a solo sort of piano form, really, essentially. Although you could, add other instruments to it, but essentially it was quite a solo piano thing, often. And that was a real specialism of his. But then broadening out into generally more blues. And, for instance, a pianist called Otis Spann, who played in Muddy Waters Blues Band. Yeah. And that may come back to that later because at that time, agencies would bring American blues musicians over and then they would be backed by a British band. And we did a couple of tours like that with American blues artists, which was a fantastic experience.
So you were a four-piece. There was you on bass, Pip on drums, Phil on guitar, and his brother Steve on keys.
Keys.
And who was singing?
Well, Steve did a bit of singing.
And what were you playing? What was it? Your own material or covers or a mixture?
It very much started out. We were quite. Again, a sort of... I think we wanted to be quite an authentic blues band, but we quite quickly started to branch out into kind of putting our own tunes together. And on the record, which is Carol Grimes and Delivery, there's and I get even though I'm not on the record, because I left, which is, I don't know why exactly now, but I did.
It's another story, yeah.
There's another story.
Yeah.
But, quite a lot of the music that we worked on during that time basically ended up on that record.
Yeah.
So it was essentially blues, but and I think now with hindsight, especially with Phil getting so into composition and Pip, for that matter, and I think we were always going to start bringing our own ideas into it quite quickly.
I got a cheat sheet here because I did.
I'm glad you have.
I did some research. The truth of it is that I tried to not do too much research because I wanted to see what came out in conversation. Yeah. But there was a few things that I found out.
Fine.
I don't know if they're true because you know what the internet's like, and you've already started to mention these things. One of the things you said is about the Canterbury scene. Maybe we come back to that because at the moment we're Cambridge direction.
Yes.
This is all happening more around Cambridge.
Absolutely.
But there's always this link with this phrase, the Canterbury scene. So maybe we explore that in a minute, and find out where all that came from.
A few people have. It's interesting, but hard to pin down, I would say.
Yeah, and also it's just because the other thing that really struck me when I was doing the research was that there's so many bands that, let's say, your musical adventures are linked with, and when you look at the players in those bands, they've been in so many bands. There's such a network,
there's
such
a lot of
huge,
interaction.
Yeah, interaction, and it seems in some ways to be like really thick and fast, like constant. Like bands forming for 3 months and then disbanding, and another band coming along. And when you look at some of their let me think of an example like King Crimson. When you look at King Crimson's, let's say, band members over time, there's been hundreds of them almost.
True. Yeah.
So, I mean, what I wanted to ask about, you've already been talking about the gigs that you were doing, and that you were doing these. That agents would send over people from America. I got 3 names. Otis Spann, you already mentioned.
Yeah, he was one of them.
He was, okay, if I've got this right, he was considered to be a leading post-war Chicago blues pianist, like one of the top guys. Yeah. So you did a tour with him. What was that like?
It was great. I mean, I think we got to play our own set, and then the second half of the evening was with Otis.
So you were his backing band?
Yeah, entirely.
And
I think it worked quite well because Steve used to carry around a very small real piano.
Yeah.
And I think, as far as I remember, a real piano, which was like, imagine that, even a small one is a heavy old thing. But I think that was quite a big attraction. So as far as I remember, Otis Spann would have used that.
So how did that work? So he arrived from America, how? On a boat, on a plane?
Plane, I should think.
Okay. And he was staying somewhere near you guys and you rehearsed, or he just told you on the night what to do?
I don't think we rehearsed. You know what blues is like. I mean, we were quite, that was our field. We knew it was obviously often based around 12 bars. Maybe the keys could vary a bit, and tempos, But essentially, blues was mostly based around the 12-bar form. So, in that sense, it was quite easy for us to.
Can you remember much of it? I mean, how was it?
Not a lot, to be honest. I mean, I think it was 2 weeks, but I think we did the last gig for that tour was in Edinburgh, and it was a wonderful concert, then we also did another tour backing a guy called Lowell Fulsom.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Right.
Like, yeah.
And so I get a bit mixed up with events on those two tours, which was, like I say, it must have
So
been.
what my research told me was that he was probably, if not the most important, one of the most important West Coast blues players in the 1940s and 1950s. So he was quite an influential guy.
He was. He had a name, and actually, one of his biggest claim to fame was he wrote a song called "Tramp," which Otis Redding and Carla Thomas covered, and it was a big hit. So I hope he got some composing royalties for that. I think he did. I think his name was on it. He was a lovely guy.
Yeah.
Very kind of in the B.B. King mould, quite sort of, he wasn't like, where the Chicago blues is very raw and almost like just Delta musicians sort of suddenly moving from acoustic instruments to electric instruments and pretty much playing the same thing. So it was pretty sort of kind of, I wouldn't say crude but compared, say, to B.B. King or Lowell Fulsom, they were more into more of a jazz slick sort of presentation. They were more dressed up, and the music was a little bit more sophisticated, I would say.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, it's difficult to how to say it. There's something about the raw part of what you're saying. That raw musicianship. Like the Delta blues. That is amazing, but there's also something about B.B. King. B.B. King, he sounds, when you first listen to it, it sounds really slick, but simple. But when you look at it, it's not. Like he really, 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 really studied what he was doing.
Well, yeah, and I think he was just out playing and singing since he was so high, and he was just such a pro. And he just exuded this amazing warmth, because... having read stuff since, but I think he was doing a radio show as well. He was like a radio presenter, again, from a young age, and just and playing. And if, record didn't play or something, he had to just quickly put in some live stuff,
I don't know if I'm in the right ballpark here, because I might be a few years out, but at some point, he sat in on one of your gigs.
Well...
Was it at this time, or was it a bit later?
It was at this time, because we were touring. We were on the tour with Lowell Fulsom, and one of the venue we played in London was called the 100 Club on Oxford Street, which is a famous old jazz club. It's nothing swanky about it. It was pretty gritty, but it was a lot of trad jazz was played down there.
Was it like Ronnie Scott's? Was it
not really? No. It was more, I would say, it wasn't as, Ronnie's is more like a nightclub with low lighting, and you sit at a table. All right, there's people around the back, but essentially it's more sort of upmarket. No, 100 Club was pretty basic. And of course, then quite a few punk acts played down there early on. It was a pretty, no unpretentious sort of place, the 100 Club. But we were playing down there. It was packed, and we played, and then we played with Lowell, and then, B.B. King was in town, and a friend of Lowell's, and he came down to see him, and he ended up sitting in with us. And
so how was that?
That was just magical, we really thought. I think he might have even maybe borrowed Phil Miller's guitar, or maybe I'm pretty sure he played Phil's guitar. And we were just in dreamland. We thought we'd really arrived. Of course, the truth was not quite as simple as that.
So, but But how long was he on stage with you for?
I'd say we played a couple of numbers. I think sort of towards the end. It was absolutely.
No, that's amazing.
That's
really amazing.
It really was.
So again, I don't know if I've got the timeline of this right, but at some point, if I understood, you and someone else, one of the other people that you're playing with, decided to start a night somewhere.
Well, that's right. Pip and I, when we were still in Cambridge before we moved to London, so I think would have. The exact dates are a bit hazy, I must admit. It's a long time ago. But while Pip and I, and I think it was while we were in our second year at Cambridge Tech, we started up a club at the place called the Rose in Cambridge, in Rose Crescent, and we were there for a while. and we played there ourselves, and we also booked Chicken Shack to play. They played at least once there. Quite quickly, we moved to another pub called the Red Cow, which was our most successful time, the Red Cow in Cambridge. And in that time, we put ourselves on, including one night with Alexis Corner, who at that time was the sort of godfather of British blues.
Yeah.
And
do you want to say a little bit about him from your perspective?
Alexis, yeah, I mean,
because I hear him mentioned so often.
Well, absolutely pivotal around the early Stones and the Blues Incorporated with Long John Baldry, and I think Rod Stewart was involved in that. And it was a really sort of happening time at that point. And Alexis, he was an interesting guy. He was a real hustler, I would say, without not wishing to put him down. He needed to make a living, so he was doing a lot of different work, including radio. His DJ presenting on radio, plus voiceovers. Yeah. Quite often you'd be in the cinema and you'd have someone speaking in a really gravelly voice, and that'd be Alexis doing his voiceover on an ad for chocolates or whatever it was. You go, I recognise that voice. But he was a friendly guy. He was a good musician. He played acoustic guitar. It was quite it wasn't mainstream. It was kind of, I would say, esoteric. His guitar playing. He was reportedly he influenced John McLaughlin, because McLaughlin had an acoustic guitar which he put a pickup on. But so he was, again, I don't know. Oops, sorry.
It's okay.
I seem to be using the word authentic a lot.
Yeah.
But he was quite authentic. It certainly from his musical thing, and he was also very entrepreneurial. He was interested in, like I say, trying to make a living. And I remember just a little. It was a funny thing that I remember, but because once we met him through booking him and playing with him, and he loved our band, and then he even took Steve. He especially liked Steve, the piano player, but for a couple of gigs he took Steve, myself and Pip to back him up on some gigs.
Yeah.
Kind of that didn't really work out because, again, I'd not been playing long and I was kind of felt a bit out of my depth. And anyway, we basically got the sack. But he kept Steve, and he had a little band at that stage, Alexis, with Steve on piano and Robert Plant, vocals and harmonica, who was at that time just about, getting to get. They were literally, it was just Zeppelin were just forming.
I think it's fantastic that you just roll these names off your tongue.
That would be.
No, I think it's amazing. I think it's really amazing.
Well, it is that time, Nick.
Yeah.
It really was. There was so much, which maybe we'll get onto, but literally everything was sort of taking off, and the possibilities were huge.
I know that also. Okay, I don't know. I heard that another band that you booked at that time was Fleetwood Mac.
We did.
Was this which incarnation of Fleetwood Mac?
That was the original arcade.
So Peter Green,
Danny Cohen, and Jeremy Spencer. I think it was like 3 guitars plus John McVie and Mick Fleetwood.
Wow!
And
how was that?
It was great, Nick. Because we were running this club in this little room above in the Red Cow, and we booked Fleetwood Mac for 45 quid. And the place was packed, because even then, they were...
45 quid back then probably was, what, like £1,000?
I said, it's hard to say, isn't it?
Yeah. Maybe 800?
Maybe add a nought or two. I'm not sure about, 1,000, but it was probably, you could add a nought for sure.
Yeah, okay.
But no, it was really good. I mean, it's funny, my brother remembers he coming to the gig, and all he remembers is being up in the front, and they're all like swearing at each other, they're all effing and blinding, you fucking wanker, and sort yourself out, and really having, and, they were like that, I think. But it was a great night. Obviously, a wonderful band. I mean, Peter Green was a wonderful player.
Yeah.
And singer, and just musician all round, but he didn't really want to be out front, did he? And that's why I think he had, the 2 other guys, and he was always a bit like that.
It's incredible because, how to say this? I'm not sure if what I'm about to say is true or accurate, but I would imagine that not a lot of people unless they're hardcore musicians, would know who Peter Green is. But he's probably one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century, I would say.
Well, I wouldn't. I don't know, about that, but he was a wonderful player. I mean, I heard Clapton with Cream. In fact, I went to hear John Mayall's band thinking it was going to be Eric Clapton on guitar, and it turned out to be Peter Green's first gig.
But I was going to say, I think that he was up there with people like Clapton.
Absolutely, of course he was, yeah.
That's what I mean, yeah.
Especially, arguably, because he was someone who put a lot of value on authenticity. He was very authentic. It was almost like, well, he wasn't copying B.B. King, but he sort of had absorbed it to such an extent that he could, kind of regurgitate it, and it would come out sounding like Peter Green, But it was wonderful. No, he's a great. Yeah, it's a shame he's not better known, but sadly he went quite off the rails.
Yeah, something just caught my eye there. I think it's all okay. Just let me double check. Yes.
No, but getting back to Alexis a little bit, he was a really. He brought a lot of people together, definitely, at that time. Even including, like I say, I think he employed Charlie Watts. I think the Stones sort of took Charlie from Alexis's band. That's the story.
So the band that you were playing in at this time, this was Delivery. We're getting towards the end of the 60s, like 69, 70, something like this.
Yes.
You're surrounded by names that everybody knows, like B.B. King and Fleetwood Mac and all of Alexis Corner, all of these people. So at some point you left Delivery, or something happened and you went in another direction.
I think it was probably to do with my sort of personal circumstances. I think I got together with my then partner, and I think that could have had something to do with it. We ended up moving, whereas I'd been in London with living sharing a flat with Pip in East Sheen, and I think Jenny and I moved back to Cambridge, and then we got a cottage out in the country. It was a bit like dropping out. It's like I'm leaving the rat race, sort of.
So Jenny was your girlfriend or your partner? Or?
Yes, she was.
Yeah, and Jenny Spires.
Correct.
Yeah.
We have a beautiful daughter, Jess, who's I'm very close to, of course, still. So I think it was partly that, but I also did feel out of my depth musically, because as well with Delivery, the essential group, as you've mentioned, was the four. Then we added Carol, who's a great singer and a lovely person, and also a saxophonist called Lol Coxill. Yeah. And Lol was again quite not a household name, but in certain circles, very well known, a seminal sort of UK improviser and musician, saxophonist, tenor, and so on.
I think it's fair to say, I mean, okay, you hit the ground running. I did. You had been playing the bass for 6 weeks, and then you ended up in this, and
I think at a certain point
it was like 4 or 5 years of constant work.
It was probably only 2, Nick, actually.
2, okay.
But nonetheless, it was a concentrated 2 years, and I think it did sort of catch up with me a bit in the end. I sort of thought, what am I doing? I really don't know what I'm doing, and I think I was. I don't think I was. I wouldn't have done it the same way again, looking back. Okay. Because with hindsight, that was a great band who really would sort of had an idea of where they wanted to go and did go places, to a large extent, albeit in different combinations. So with hindsight, I don't think it was a good decision. The only good thing about, and I've said before, of leaving Delivery really was I got to play with Syd Barrett in Cambridge when we went back. I went back to Cambridge.
Okay,
which is another story.
Yeah, no, let's talk about that. I mean, this is incredible. Part of me feels like I don't need to explain who Syd Barrett is, and another part of me feels like we should. So maybe I'll let you explain who Syd is.
Well, he was a founding member of Pink Floyd.
Would you say he was the founding member?
In a way, the thing wasn't it. They were a couple of years older than me. I didn't know them personally until I met Syd through Jenny, and that was the way I met Syd, was because they were good friends and had been an item previously. But it is funny. You can still talk to people. Everybody knows Pink Floyd, but not everybody knows Syd Barrett. Unless, maybe of a certain generation, or maybe real, serious fans, obviously, probably would know, because he's on the first record, isn't he? Piper at the Gates of Dawn.
I'm going to rustle my papers for a second, because there was something that I found interesting. I don't know whether I agree with this. I don't know whether you agree with it, but there is. I don't. I'm saying there was. He may still be alive. I'm not sure. But Nick Kent was a journalist, very famous in the 70s, in the NME.
Yes,
and he wrote some books as well. And basically, he is quoted as saying that Kevin Ayers and Syd Barrett were the two most important people in British pop. Everything that came after them. And I don't know whether you agree with that.
Well, not really, because, if you want to talk about pop music, the Beatles were way out in front, weren't they? And for that matter, the Stones, and, But
do you think that they were influenced, the Stones and the Beatles?
They were huge people, huge. Yes. Nick Kent, I never met him, but I know that he had a certain sort of. I've never met him, so I can't. But I know that he had a sort of romantic love of the sort of kind of outlaw rock star sort of vibe, people like Keith and Richards and Kevin as well was a very charismatic, charming, talented, clever guy, know. And by all accounts, so was Syd. In his younger days, he was a really friendly, outgoing, life and soul of the party type guy, very talented, really good painter, wonderful songwriter, obviously, and very much sort of the ideas man for the early Floyd, as far as I understand it. And I think that's well attested by people who know more than me.
So you're in Cambridge, if I understood, you're in Cambridge, you're with Jenny, and you meet Syd.
Yes.
Syd Barrett. And a drummer called Twink, is
Correct,
that right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So
John Alder, but known as Twink. A lovely guy, very nice, very good drummer, still going strong, living in Marrakesh.
Okay.
At that stage, Syd had his big success with Floyd. They'd sort of taken off into, at least, if not the stratosphere, at least well on the way, because they were real flavour of the month. London, everybody was going, in London, have you heard them? And then plus having hit records, they made records. They had See Emily Play and other they had top 10 singles, and so Syd would be known from appearing on Top of the Pops. But he'd had a kind of what you could only describe as a breakdown, really, I think. And, some people might say that Floyd were hard-nosed or heartless. I don't really buy that. I think everybody, what it's like to be in a band. You're all trying to, you're all really trying to make it work and make it happen, and if someone is not pulling their weight, well, in the end, you have to say, well, look, sorry, or, either just you move on. And I think essentially is, from what I hear, is what happened with Syd and Floyd. But so he was kind of back in Cambridge, sort of having suddenly had this amazing success, and then suddenly back down to and living in his mum's basement and kind of rather isolated. And Jenny, of course, was a friend still. They were close, and we sort of felt, well, poor Syd, he's sort of stuck in his mum's basement, and why don't we get him out? And he came to our house, and we played a bit, and then so then we thought, well, that's right, because Twink and I, as well as before we formed the band, we were running a sort of a jam night in central Cambridge, and which was where we get people. We were sort of the house band, and we'd get people to come and play with us. And Syd came and sat in a few times, and he enjoyed that. I think just because even though he wasn't the sort of, well, he's not a household name now, but obviously he's a kind of cult hero. But he was known, and he was known in Cambridge, and you saw him walking around Cambridge in his beautiful black velvet, suit, and looking like a rock star, only sort of withdrawn and a bit sort of not struggling to react or to relate to people. He was somewhat withdrawn for whatever reason. I don't know why, and that's another story. But so yeah, we thought, yeah, let's see if we can help him out a bit and help ourselves out. I'm not going to say we didn't think that, but initially it started out just through jamming together. I think Twink and I we did a couple of gigs backing visiting blues musicians, and again Syd came to a couple of those things, and then we thought, well, let's make a band together. And we did this. It was just the three of us, and the first gig we did was a little cafe in Cambridge, and it was great. It was an afternoon gig. There was no pressure. We were just playing. We hadn't rehearsed much. We were playing a few blues. We were playing any of Syd's songs that we could kind of quickly busk together, and it worked great, and everybody loved it. And
how was Syd?
Well, he was. I would say he was quite withdrawn, quite. I think he really did struggle to relate to people, which I think became something that continued during his life. He was a recluse essentially.
Yeah,
and luckily he could afford to be a recluse. He was still getting income from. But at that stage, I think that was right at the beginning of his sort of almost withdrawal from society. But so while that first gig was fine because there was no pressure.
Did he withdraw?
I would say he would. I don't know if you've ever known anybody who had a sort of a breakdown, and I don't even. I'm a bit cautious of describing it as such because I mean I know I've subsequently met his sister and she sort of said, no, not really. He was fine as long as people weren't making demands on him.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, in some ways, this is really private stuff, but it's also it's fascinating. I mean, let me try and just put some kind of framework around it, so maybe you can see why it's so fascinating for me, at least. A lot of this stuff is reported. And obviously, papers try and sensationalise everything, and the stuff that's put onto the internet, you just don't know whether it's true or not.
You don't.
Yeah. So, one of the things that was said about Syd Barrett was that Pink Floyd, their original intention was to kind of like keep him on as a non-touring member, like Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, but that didn't happen. And it's also reported that they made some kind of. It's difficult to get the right wording for this, right? Because I'm definitely not trying to slate them, but they made what you could call a business decision because they wanted to continue as a successful band, and they didn't see that they could do it with Syd Barrett.
And Dave Gilmour had already come in, of course, and for I think some gigs they had Syd and Dave there.
Yeah,
apparently.
But is it? I think it's true to say that Syd did record things over the next few years.
Absolutely,
and he did it with members of Pink Floyd,
especially with Dave Gilmour. I think they were close and good friends. And of course,
So he wasn't just shoved out.
no, I don't think so.
No.
And apart from anything else, Nick, they were all signed to, I think it was EMI at the time, and he was still under contract to make records. And I think as Dave did a good job and did to get Syd into a studio and record. I think Dave was very instrumental, as I understand it, in the recording of Madcap Laughs and the second Barrett solo album.
So the other thing is that probably now, I mean, mental health is still quite a taboo subject. It's not as taboo as it was then, but it probably was a very, very misunderstood thing.
Just wasn't talked about at all, really.
Yeah, exactly.
No.
So he had a breakdown, and probably that was kept quiet. It wasn't, like something they traded on. There wasn't a big headline or.
No, I think it just sort of, he kind of slipped into not obscurity, but he didn't want the limelight, and so therefore he just kind of backed away from it, and Floyd just picked it up and ran with it, didn't they? Really.
But I don't know whether I can think of an example, but I mean, I've seen some things on YouTube, for example, of Syd Barrett performing, and definitely like 65, 66, 67, he looked like he was in his element.
Absolutely. Yes.
So something happened.
Yes, something happened. No one quite knows what. I certainly don't. I mean, some people allege that, I think a lot of people were smoking dope and taking acid at that time.
Yeah.
It was very much the sort of heyday of that.
Yeah.
And Syd, I think, probably was part of that. Not everybody had a breakdown, so I don't think it was. I don't think you can, just say it was the drugs or that he was spiked. I mean, maybe.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, there's no real clinical evidence, for example, that taking LSD is going to cause you to have a breakdown.
No. I think we can say these days that for some people it could cause a problem, couldn't it?
Yeah.
Syd was an exceptional person, a very talented, sensitive guy.
Yeah.
But, maybe there was other stuff going on. He'd lost his father a few years earlier. It's hard to put your finger on it. I mean, funnily enough, talking about Peter Green, you could say there are similarities there.
Yeah.
Again, a very promising, talented guy, just sort of went off the rails and decided to drop out effectively for some time,
Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, I'm not even sure. I have to really dig deep here. Probably Fleetwood Mac songs that people would know from Peter Green would be Albatross.
Yes, for sure.
And Oh Well. Is it Oh Well or Oh Well?
Yes, Green Manalishi. Maybe stuff like...
But Oh Well, I mean, I'm not even going to attempt to try and hum that, but I think that it'd be very, very...
Or is that... Yeah, I think it's that one.
That's the one. Yeah.
Very bluesy.
And I think that most people would know that because that's become almost like a festival standard. There's so many rock bands that cover that now. I think even the later incarnation of Fleetwood Mac covered it.
They probably do. It'd be good if they did. Why wouldn't they? Yeah, because they've got the original bass and drums on it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's a track that everybody knows, but probably nobody knows it. It's Peter Green.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
One of his most famous songs, because Santana covered it, was Black Magic Woman. That was a Peter Green song.
Was that one of his?
Absolutely.
I didn't know that.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these people, they were pivotal. I mean, okay, these people. I'm talking about Kevin Ayers, Syd Barrett, Peter Green, and I've forgotten his name now, but we mentioned him, the guy from the Beach Boys.
Brian Wilson.
Wilson. They were all kind of like these incredibly talented, incredibly sensitive people who kind of like disappeared. I mean, Brian Wilson came back.
Yeah.
But I mean, after tribulations, let's say trials and tribulations. Yeah.
I think also, Nick, you've got to remember that suddenly, say to take Syd, from being a sort of like an art student and a kind of weird songwriter, suddenly you're on top of the pops, you're a pop star. And I don't know whether they had the Sun journalists camped outside, but it wouldn't surprise me. So suddenly you're exposed to this huge level of attention.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the same for all the people, well, especially people like Brian Wilson and, you know, who were major stars at the time. Suddenly you're exposed to all this often very intrusive, you know, media attention, people trying to, unlike you leaving a club late at night after, you know, a bit the worse for wear and all that stuff is, you know.
Where was Syd from? Who's from Cambridge, yeah?
He was from Cambridge, yeah.
So 1 minute you're in Cambridge, next minute you're on Santa Monica Boulevard in LA, yeah?
Yeah, I mean...
That kind of thing is what you mean, yeah?
Well, I was more meaning the sudden huge media interest, especially potentially intrusive tabloid interest.
And also
thing,
your geographic reach suddenly is huge as well.
That too. But I think it's suddenly being a pop star, you know.
Yeah.
You know, and and more like, normally you would be expecting and want that kind of attention, and someone like Syd, I think, struggled with it.
So you're in Cambridge, you're with Jenny. I think you said you're in a little house or a cottage or something.
We had a cottage outside of Cambridge, yeah.
You've there's this link between Jenny and Syd. You've got in contact with him. You've done a few. You said you played in a cafe, and it went down.
That was great because there was no pressure. But then quite quickly we got booked onto a bill, and a mutual friend of ours, a promoter called Steve Brink, was putting on gigs at Cambridge Corn Exchange, which is a big, still there.
Is that the Ottawa company? No, that's something else.
No, that was something else. No, that was something else.
Yeah.
No, these were more mainstream rock gigs. He did quite big promotions of bands like Nectar, Hawkwind, Pink Fairies. They were playing to big crowds, and we were put on a bill with, I think it was Nectar and MC5, the American rock group. And, you know, and it's a big venue, it's a big old stage. I mean, you're talking what it was, 71, 72.
Yeah.
You know, the sort of amplification, PAs, all the sound equipment was, you know, incredibly primitive compared to what we have now. It was big. You had big stacks and stuff, but it was like blunt instrument. You know, it wasn't sophisticated. It was loud, big and loud. But so suddenly you're on a big stage in the Corn Exchange. MC5 did a set, and they absolutely laid waste to everybody. It was like a really hard rocking set, and we went after that, and we never really. And that was really our final gig because all the wheels really did come off because. We had technical problems. I think everything was breaking down. We had,
but the way that this is, let's say, reported now, and I'm just trying to get a feel for it, how it was for you guys then, because the way that this is reported now is that the band that you were in with Twink and Syd Barrett, so it's you, Twink and Syd Barrett in Stars, it was reported as the next big British supergroup.
Well, I think that's a slight exaggeration because, you know, we had quite a large reputation locally in Cambridge because of our local connections, but I don't think that was sort of extended nationwide. And already Floyd were already, you know, just sort of
gliding up there,
taking off, you know, and so I don't think we were never in that league.
So that's just sensationalised.
For me, that is a bit over, over egging it.
And at what point did you realise, or did it become apparent that it wasn't going to go anywhere with Syd?
I think on that night, on that gig. It was just such a disaster, and it was quite a public disaster. I think it was Steve Lake from Melody Maker came and wrote it up for Melody Maker, and it was sort of it's now a sort of like legendary gig because it was like a sort of band sort of falling apart in front of your very eyes sort of thing. It literally was that, really. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to.
And was
say
this one of the last times that Syd Barrett was seen in public
I
for
believe
quite a
it
long
was
time?
his last gig
Yeah.
ever. Mm-hmm. That's my understanding. That's what I've been told subsequently. But I wouldn't, it was clear that Syd was not happy, didn't want to be. He just couldn't wait to get off the stage.
Really?
Nothing was.
Yeah.
I mean, and to be fair to him, at least Floyd, they'd rehearsed, they'd made records, they had keyboards as well. We were just a three-piece. Like a three-piece. Everybody's got to be on top of their game. And
I was going to say, I mean, that is a real tall order.
It's
You've got
demanding,
to be, yeah.
Yes, lineup to make work.
I mean, let's put that into context. The Police is a really good example of a three-piece.
Absolutely.
They were every single one of them on it.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. That's what Cream would be another, or even Hendrix group, arguably. But Police is the perfect example where you've got everybody's absolutely firing, and without any one of them, it's all not going to work, is it?
It's going to fall apart. Yeah, you've got nothing to back up.
And so I think this was an early experiment in that sort of thing, and a public sort of, I don't want to say humiliation, but for me it was a disaster, and I wanted to move on quickly, and that's what I did. I just started doing loads of other stuff.
Well, with that in mind, let me look at my cheat sheet, because I mean I don't know if I've got the timing of this right again, but at some point you're at a gig and you're having a conversation with someone you've never met before, and they're confiding in you that they want to leave the band. They're thinking about leaving a band. A drummer called Bill Bruford. Is that right?
I don't know where you... The funny thing is, I remember I was playing with Delivery. We were playing at Leeds University, and Yes were on the bill, and they were sound checking, and I was up at the sound desk, and there was a guy sitting next to the engineer, sort of just clocking it, and I had a good chat with him, and he said, I used to play in the band, I'm a drummer. I left because I decided I better get my degree sorted out and do that. But I really regret it because I can see these guys are good, and I can see I can play better than the guy they've got now.
Yeah.
And we did have that conversation, and then he subsequently did rejoin the band, yes, and played on the first few records. But I've never met or spoken to Bill since that day.
Really? That's really...
So,
just one little conversation. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, it was funny, that.
So let me have a look. Let's talk a little bit about the Canterbury scene and progressive rock. Those two terms.
Okay.
We chatted about this the other day when we were at some live bar, like we were playing music live. And
Sirocco,
at Sirocco's. And basically I was asking whether that was a term, those were terms that were being used at the time. And you explained to me that probably you weren't really aware of those terms. But at some point you must have been.
I think prog rock I would have been aware of first. I mean, speaking of Yes, would probably be an archetypal prog rock band, maybe Genesis, maybe King Crimson. So I, these days, well, maybe not quite as much, but we're very genre obsessed, aren't we? And for marketing purposes, record companies always want to say, well, what genre is it, or what combination of genres? How can we market this? And I think it probably was a marketing sort of term to some extent.
But you didn't think of yourself as a progressive rock player?
No, if anything, I probably reacted against that part of it more, because I had it's funny, I was having a conversation with Eric Peachy the other day, and we were saying the thing about...
Should we say who Eric is?
Well, Eric is a neighbour of mine, and the reason I'm actually in Spain, because I came to stay with him a few years ago, and I've been kept on coming back ever since, because I'd kind of lost touch with him and his wife Marilyn, but then we bumped into each other, and so I see quite a bit of him because we're staying in we're neighbours in Spain. But I remember, and he'd I originally met Eric, and he was a drummer in a blues band called Doc K's Blues Band. He came to play at our club that Pip and I were running, and then our paths crossed. We met in London. We played in a band in London with a guy called John Owen, and but Eric also had, as well as his blues side, he also played in what you could call a prog rock band called Khan, which, again, for people of students, if people who are interested will know, they made a couple of records.
Steve Hillage.
Yeah. The keyboard player, Dave Stewart, not Eurythmics, Dave Stewart.
That must be a bummer to have to always explain that.
It must be a bit. Mind you, I think he's got over it, I think. But yeah, Eric was in that, so he has that sort of Canterbury prog connection, if you like.
Yeah.
But I was saying to Eric, the funny thing about Canterbury scene is it's not rock and roll. It really is. It just isn't. It doesn't borrow from that. If anything, it was more probably influenced by classical music and maybe jazz. Certainly with what Phil and Pip brought to it, they really brought their love of jazz to it. But it was it's just not rock and roll. It's not particularly American sounding. Often singers would sing with an English accent, and it just wasn't, although, they'd listen to American music, especially probably more jazz in some cases rather than blues. But it just wasn't really rock and roll. Didn't have a backbeat. It just was a different aesthetic. And I think that was quite hard, to market and for music fans just to get their heads around,
It's strange because, like when I was looking at all of this, when I was, doing research, it's like you get a handful of jigsaw pieces and then you're trying to put them all together. Yeah. And more or less the terms that kept on coming up were progressive rock and the Canterbury scene. And there's so many names that you've mentioned that they're always linked with those two terms, progressive rock and the Canterbury scene. So it's just trying to understand that, like whether you all thought of yourselves as part of the Canterbury scene and as progressive rockers.
I certainly didn't. And for some years, I really kicked against. I didn't want to be even a minor part of Canterbury scene because I didn't feel I'd earned it really. I didn't, it wasn't. If anything, like I said before, I was slightly more uncomfortable with that side of writing music in maybe in odd time signatures and that was maybe more art music than certain, like I say, not rock and roll. I mean, the one thing I would say, Nick, is that I don't know whether you'd agree, but I've heard Pink Floyd included as prog rock.
Yeah, I mean,
but obviously that's the more accessible end, you could say, of prog rock.
Well, I mean, when I was looking at this, because I was trying to understand what prog rock was, because I wasn't really a fan of that kind of music.
No.
I knew people who were. I knew people who talked about King Crimson, and but it wasn't really my kind of thing.
Sure.
Some of those players, they kind of like did a sideways. You're going to ask me who in a minute. I'm probably not going to be able to say anyone, but some of them kind of like did a sideways step into like heavy metal or people like Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow.
Yeah.
Because Ritchie Blackmore's that's maybe a good example because they were kind of like fantasy, like their songs were kind of like almost about English, like folklore topics, like dragons and princesses and all of this kind of stuff, which seemed to be topics that Pink Floyd certainly were kind of like, and let's say Led Zeppelin.
Zeppelin as well, I was going to say.
Like Stairway to Heaven.
Absolutely, and all that kind of Lord of the Rings stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So those are the things. Avant-garde fusion of psychedelia. Okay, we'll come back to that. English fantasy, Baroque and traditional folk. Okay, wow.
Absolute. Good references, I'd say.
But psychedelia, what do they mean by psychedelia? I mean, but psychedelia for me, that's magic mushrooms, LSD, DMT.
But in terms of music, it's yes, I suppose it's music influenced by psychedelic experience, you know. I mean, the funny thing was, I think, again, Floyd would have been considered very much in that category. And yet, you know, what I know Syd experimented with psychedelic, but from what I've heard, not so much the other guys in the band, but that was sort of the bracket they got put into. And especially, I suppose, with the light shows, obviously they were famous for that, weren't they?
Yeah.
And which was very much a part of their thing. They didn't do gigs without the full production, you know.
The full shebang.
And they were really, you know, really did have their heads screwed on that way, I would say.
Yeah.
You know, they knew how to sell it. I mean, it's interesting with something like you say, Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow. I mean, he came from Deep Purple, right?
Yeah.
They were a sort of hard rock band.
Yeah.
And then it went, with Rainbow, even maybe a bit more poppy, maybe. They had some big hits, didn't they?
Yeah.
You know, and it was generally very accessible, you know, main sort of...
But they were kind of like, maybe you could say that they were, at that time, on parallel paths with Black Sabbath. Yeah. You know, that kind of... Black... I mean, okay, how can you...
Yeah, so it is interesting. You know, how did... Or even a band like Zeppelin, how did... All right, they started out as quite a sort of, we want to be an esoteric rock band. We don't want to be a pop band. But, you know, their music was popular, so but almost by default, some of their music did become pop music, didn't it?
I think what I was trying to get to is if you look at Syd Barrett's lyrics, certainly, they were very, very kind of like free-flow, romantic.
Mm-hmm. Yes, stream of...
Yes, stream of consciousness, but fantasy-like. So was that... Okay, this is maybe an unfair question. I'm not trying to catch anyone out, but was that more to do with like a love of English folklore or a love of psychedelics? Which was the influence, do you think?
I suppose, you know, he had absorbed things in his childhood that... You know, like, for instance, Alice in Wonderland, which is kind of pretty psychedelic, isn't it, really?
Absolutely.
You know, before anybody ever heard of, you know, anything like that. But I don't really know, Nick. I don't really know. I think what he did bring was a nice humour to it. It kind of, even though when I met him, he wasn't great, you know, he wasn't cracking jokes by any means, but there is humour in the lyrics and kind of that just kind of surreal, a surreality, if that's a word.
I think really what it is that I'm trying to get to. I mean, if you look at a songwriter's process or a band's process of actually coming up with material, there's so many elements to it. Yeah. You know, like there's the musical influences, there's the equipment, the instruments you're playing. Then there's the culture that's going on at the time. Yeah, you know, like you're talking about psychedelics and everything like that. All I'm really trying to do is just try to understand how the process that was going on for writing, or whether it was something that was constantly changing, whether there was a method to it. Whether it was something that changed from year to year, experimental, this kind of thing.
Well, from what I understand about the way the bands, for instance, like Floyd, or maybe a band like Hatfield and the North, which Pip and Phil were in, which is again a seminal Canterbury band, Hatfield and the North. Yeah, all the four members of both those groups. Maybe I better stick to Hatfields, who I know better. Yeah, they were all composers anyway. They all were songwriters stroke composers, so they'd all bring material and ideas to the band, and then the band as a whole would decide how they were going to use it and how they would include it in the overall thing of what the band was doing. So I think essentially it's like you've got members of the band who are also, as well as being musicians and performers, they're also composers, songwriters, whatever you want to call it. You know, so and I think probably with Floyd, I don't know as well, but I gather that their way of working is just improvising and jamming, but then recording everything, listening back to it, and saying, "Oh, there's a couple of minutes there." You know, that's a nice idea. We've got the sound as sort of an atmosphere, and we've got some interesting chords or a bit of a melody or whatever it is, and we'll sort of put something together from that and end up with ultimately a very written and composed and arranged piece. Like, you know, especially Floyd. I mean, Hatfields, it was a bit more. They were, you know, they weren't a pop band by any means. They were quite difficult, really, but. You know, how are we going to combine this? They play sets, and Floyd, that again would be the same, I believe, with Floyd, continuous sets for 1 hour, maybe even longer.
Yeah.
You know, and Hatfield's very much the same. So it would be like numbers would just segue straight from one to another without a gap. Nobody saying, and no announcements, just, you know, solid music for. And that was how I think, you know, their modus operandi, if you like, say, for the Hatfields, where everybody had material, had ideas for songs, and then they bring it to the band, and the band would decide how to use it in rehearsal, eventually into a recording studio, making a record. But
so there, you're in Cambridge. You've had this experience with Stars. One of the things that I saw was that you did at least one show, maybe some shows, with the Ottawa Company. Would you say a little bit about what they are and who they are? And I'm going to just show this to the camera, but I'll get a bit graphic of it later on. But more or less, what that is a poster for the Ottawa Company. And it's the gig that you did.
Oh, right. Is it in Kensington Town Hall?
Yes.
Right.
So what was the Ottawa Company? And the reason why this caught my eye is that it's got Steve Hillage, Eric Peachy, you were talking about.
Right. Wow.
Dave Stewart, you were talking about.
Yeah.
It's got Henry Cow.
Yeah.
Which is a name that keeps on coming up as a band from... to do with progressive rock.
Indeed, yeah.
And you're on here with Lady June Campbell Kramer, or Lady June as she was known, and she sounds like quite an interesting character. I don't know if you...
Poetess. A poetess, yeah.
And Jack Monck and Tony Wilkes.
Tony Wilkes is on there. Wow, that's interesting.
So, yeah, I mean, that was quite when I saw this, it was like, wow, okay, that's a lot of names.
Yeah.
And a lot of stuff going on.
That is interesting.
Yeah. I don't know who the Ottawa Company is, so you have to tell me.
I think what it was, a sort of umbrella organisation. I mean, when I went back to Cambridge, as I said before, one of the only good things that, in a sense, with hindsight, happened was I got to play with Syd. But another good thing that happened was I met the members of Henry Cow, who were, I think 3 of them were students at Cambridge Uni, and then they included another a drummer, Chris, who was not, and a saxophonist, Jeff Lee, a good friend of mine. So I met them there, and then they were a fascinating band, Henry Cow. Again, they were incredibly creative, even more, I would say, difficult in terms of, you know, just not rock and roll, not pop music, just the most, removed from that, really, into very contemporary composition, free improvisation. It was really out there, but brilliantly done. Very good musicians.
So can I just ask a quick question? So you were saying earlier on that... earlier on in your career, you weren't interested in music theory or dots. Is this kind of like a bit of consolidation, and you know, like at this point you started to become interested in that kind of thing? Is this one of the links?
Not really to Ottawa Company, because this is early stuff. And again, Ottawa Company is not Henry Cow for me is the critical group and bunch of people, including... I don't know if it's got a date on this. I think it's early 70s. It may be 72 or 73. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I think it would have been.
Yeah.
But the connection with the Ottawa Company, I believe it was an organisation which included... well, Dave Stewart, the keyboard player, as well as members of Henry Cow and Steve Hillage. And,
Yeah.
But, you know, that the long-standing part of that, or what we have left, if you like, now, is bands like Henry Cow. Steve Hillage is a name a lot of people, music fans will know. Dave Stewart, probably, if they... so, you know, the Ottawa, in a sense, was, you know, not... I remember being invited to do it because I had a little offshoot group from Henry Cow.
Yeah.
Fred Frith, the guitarist, and Chris, the drummer, and Jeff, the sax player. We had a little offshoot band. I think it was called Sparks or something. It was very short-lived.
Yeah.
And Henry Cow was their absolute main focus for those guys because they, for a start, they were signed to Virgin. You know, along with Hatfield and the North, they were, I think, the first two bands that Virgin signed.
Yeah.
And so that was, you know, that was their main thing. This was just a little sort of side project, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just reading on it as you're saying it because it's saying that I can't actually read it because it's so small in how it's printed, but it's that Henry Cow is going to be featuring on BBC One's Top Gear.
Right. Yeah.
And it's saying don't forget to look out for that because it's going to be fantastic.
Yeah. Which was John Peel's programme, right?
Yeah, it must have been at the time.
I think so. Was it Top Gear?
No, Top Gear
is something completely different.
Top Gear is the car show with what's his name, Jeremy
Clarkson.
Jeremy Clarkson.
No, it wasn't. But yes, but you know, they would have been getting exposure on things like the John Peel show. Yeah,
yeah.
And so, as were other, you know, bands of that time, including Hatfields and Robert Wyatt from Soft Machine. You know, he's another pivotal figure in, I would say, probably, arguably, one of the top in Canterbury scene because he was a founder member of Soft Machine. We haven't mentioned them, but they were, in a way...
Who else was in Soft Machine?
Well, Kevin Ayers was in it for a while.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, Robert... Hugh Hopper, the bass player, Mike Ratledge. And, you know, again, this is another band that went through many different editions and many different musical sort of policy changes, you know. Yeah. They really, you know, covered a spectrum.
I'm going to quickly... I mean, another name... We've covered so much. I'm just wondering whether we should cover too much more. But, I mean, the names that...
Yeah, it's ancient history, this, Nick. I mean, not that it's not interesting for people like me, but...
No, I think it's very interesting. But, I mean, there's two bands that keep on coming up, Egg and Khan. Khan I know a little bit about. Egg I don't know anything about. Khan I know because it's Steve Hillage and Eric Peachy was in it.
Correct.
Yeah.
And Dave Stewart, the keyboard player, who was also in Egg. So he was the common link to Egg... Khan, and then Hatfield and the North, and then another band called National Health, another Canterbury band.
And so, I was going to say, so this is all part of the Canterbury scene, and I think that maybe a good thing to mention, just for a minute, I've forgotten his name, but it's a man that interviewed you. He's a French guy, Améric?
Améric Leroy, yeah.
Because he wrote a book about the Canterbury scene, didn't he?
He did. I would like to read it, but have not so far done so. He's a great guy. He's an absolute authority on all things Canterbury. He can tell me stuff that, and I was actually there, and I
was going to ask you whether it was worth a read or not, but you've said that you didn't read it. But you can recommend him as a guy.
I think he wrote it in French, and then I believe there is an English translation, but I'm not quite sure. You know what the state of publication of that is now. It'd be interesting. I need to find out. Actually.
Okay. Right.
But he is an absolute authority on this subject. You know.
We've been talking for quite a long time.
I'm going to take 5, or I'm easy, Nick. I'm okay.
I'm just thinking that. Really, the other things that I've got here are the legendary Radar favourites. I don't know if you want to say something about that. That's kind of like that's mid-70s, isn't it?
It was quite actually around the time we're talking about. I mean, what I was just did occur to me, Nick, is that we have very much focused on this period, I guess sort of late 60s, early 70s, and Radar Favourites would fit right into that. With Jeff Lee left Henry Cow, still signed to Virgin. Him and his wife formed this band, Radar Favourites, of which I was a part. We worked on some music for a few months, did a few gigs. It was promising. But then Jeff, and then there's some sort of, we remember this a bit differently, but my memory is that he and Kathy and Charles Hayward, the drummer, sacked me and Jerry, the guitar player.
Okay.
And got someone else in.
That's your memory of it.
They remember it a bit differently.
Okay.
That we'd already said we didn't want to be in. I don't think that was right, but, Okay. But it was very short-lived, Nick. It's a shame because it could have been really good, but for me, it was kind of never really achieved its potential. Yeah, and again, because I was going to say, I know we're on this talk. I didn't know exactly what you want to focus on, but so far we're narrowed into quite a short period of time. Up to say early 70s or maybe late 70s, which is 50 years ago. So obviously a lot of other stuff has happened.
Yeah.
Since
No,
then.
I mean, I'm happy to keep going. I'd like to,
fine.
I just want to make sure that you don't have any time constraints or anything like that. We can keep going.
At a certain point, I'll probably just drop Libby a text or something and say how we're getting on.
Okay. Maybe what we do is we jump from the mid-70s up to the present day, and I just say the word jazz. Yeah, because you were explaining to me just kind of, what I should admit that I've seen you a couple of times over the last couple of weeks, and each time I've seen you, I've said I don't really want to talk to you too much because I want to save it for the interview. So, but you did mention that one of the things that was so influential for you now, and I don't know when it started, but at this time was jazz. So maybe say a bit about this.
Yeah, I mean, I love all kinds of music. I like great pop music. I like, as we've discussed, blues and jazz and contemporary classical music. Even some, I love Johann Sebastian. I do like a lot of different sorts of music. But I suppose jazz at its best can sort of take from quite a few different, sources and influences, and musicians will kind of make something out of it, which is maybe a mixture of everything, and make some jazz out of it, and essentially maybe keep quite a large improvisatory element to it. Maybe not always pop music, and it's not necessarily bad because it can be simple and direct and very sort of immediate at making an impact and connecting with people, whereas other sorts of music, and maybe jazz could include that, needs a bit more listening and a bit more for the listener to sort of go with it and learn a bit about it maybe, and just kind of tune into it a bit. Yeah. But
it's almost like I'm just trying to think what it's called. I think in classical music there's a genre called program music, where if you didn't have the program in front of you and read the notes, then probably the music that you were going to listen to wouldn't make sense. Is that what you mean, that you need to kind of understand what's going on with it before it?
To some extent, I mean, yeah, I think so. But I think sometimes in live performance, sometimes people will enjoy things that if they just heard it, say, on the radio or on a record, they might say, "Oh no, that's not." It sounds a bit.
But if you were there and you
saw
it being created
live, if you're just someone who's doing it right there in front of you, sometimes that can connect, can't it? And and then they can maybe that piques their interest, and they maybe get. But, I just think live performance is different, especially something with a lot of improvisation in it, because it literally is unrepeatable, isn't it? Like the other night when you and I were playing and kind of bouncing ideas off with Javier and the other guys on the stage, and it's just like it's a one-off, isn't it?
It is a one-off.
We'll never do that again.
And I know that a couple of times where we've been doing that kind of thing, there's been some remarkable moments, and quite often those remarkable moments weren't recorded because there's quite often there's a recording going on all the time, but just as luck would have it, quite often those moments are just lost.
Well, that's just sod's law, isn't it? Absolutely, that often happens indeed. Yeah, I mean.
But it is. I mean, okay. One of the things that you were saying is that you felt that you were in at the deep end when you were, like starting out. I know that I feel like that when I'm playing with these guys because that's their thing. Their thing is improvising, and my thing is much more like studio based. Yeah. Songwriting. Yeah. Performing songs where everybody knows what they're doing. It's you're safe. Everybody knows their parts. It's incredible. I love it. I love improvising, but it's so, I don't know, scary is not the right word. It gets your adrenaline going because you really, really have to be on it. And if you lose it, you lose it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think, I agree with you. It's volatile. It's so unpredictable, improvisation. And the problem is it's very hard not only to make records of, it's very hard to sell. Who's going to,
Yeah.
I think, so I have a sort of, it's almost, and some people would say that improvising musicians are very indulgent. I mean, there's an element of that when we go to jam at Sirocco. It's like everybody, get in the mood and just sort of see what happens. Yeah. And that is indulgent, if you like. It's not.
But would you call that
sort
jazz?
Of thinking?
Is that what you mean by jazz?
Well, I don't know. Again, it's an umbrella term because jazz can include a huge amount of things. Yeah. I mean, Spanish jazz, it has a particular flavour. Brazilian jazz, British jazz, American jazz in all its diverse forms, Scandinavian jazz, so it's kind of, I think it's some music that it's hard to pin down. It's a very much an umbrella term, isn't it? You've got from New Orleans trad jazz to sort of Miles Davis's electric bands or, it's just such a huge spectrum. So it's a kind of an umbrella term, I think.
But what's the link between this kind of like diving in the deep end with improvisation and theory and notation?
I suppose. That's an interesting question. I mean, I was going to say because we started a conversation and I said we were talking about keys, you and I. Yeah. And I was saying, well, because you were saying, I think to Javier, what's a good key for, say, tenor sax to play in? And he said, well, obviously you can play in all the keys, but some, just like on guitar, the E's and the A's and the D's are nice big open chords that create a lovely sort of rich sound, and so often guitarists, if you're writing on an instrument, will go to those keys. And I remember saying to you, but just because, certain keys are good on guitar, like the open tuning, the open chords, doesn't mean you shouldn't explore other areas and learn from that because I suppose it's a learning process, Nick, and a studying process which informs, you would hope, your improvisation, especially free improvisation and just literally jamming, is it's just for the fun of it almost. If you've got an audience who enjoys it, great, but generally, that's going to be difficult. You almost just have to do it for its own sake, don't you? Like we do at Sirocco, we go and turn up because we want to experiment, try a few things out and just sort of let off a bit of steam, if you like, having done that sort of study and thought, process.
Okay, well, that's what I was getting to, because a couple of other people that I've had similar conversations with, so you will see on YouTube, you'll see kind of like ads for shortcuts of how to become an improviser on guitar or whatever, and they're saying you don't have to study, you don't need to do scales, you don't need to do this. We can show you in 5 minutes how you can become, and okay, I think that's rubbish. I'll go out there and say that now. I think you have to study, and all of the people that I've talk to about this, they've almost got an insatiable interest in how it all fits together. You know, like how the theory all knits together, and how and that's what informs their playing. And they suddenly one guy was saying to me that a few years ago he was studying a particular thing. I don't know what it was, but I think it might have actually been double stops, sixths. Yeah. And suddenly he'd been studying this a couple of years ago, and all of a sudden in his playing it started coming out a couple of years later. It had been just like melting around in his head, and he didn't know where it came from, and then he remembered that he'd been studying it for a month or two a few years ago, and then it suddenly comes out. So I like this idea that you kind of like pour this information in, and eventually it
comes out in what you're doing. Sure.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's interesting in its application to songwriting, because to write great songs and to get them down on tape, with making sure it's running and everything. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge achievement, isn't it? To make great records, I don't know, even whoever you can mention, Joni Mitchell, even just with one guitar and voice, it's like, wow, you can just hear, amazing sort of all the possibilities and the skill and kind of creativity. But again, in her case, quite sort of self-taught, I believe.
Yeah.
No, so I
Well, you mentioned Joni Mitchell. Okay. Two questions. Okay. One's actually one question with a statement before it. Her song is Paved Paradise, Pick Up a Parking Lot.
Yeah.
What's that song called? Yellow Taxi. Yellow Taxi.
Yellow Taxi. That's the
Okay.
one.
So if you sit down with a guitar and try to learn to play that, you'll be completely lost if you're not told that the guitar is tuned differently.
Okay.
And she's got a capo on. And with the guitar tuned differently, I forget what the tuning is, and the capo in a certain place, it's really easy to play.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the genius is, how did she know?
Oh, just hearing it, isn't it? Coming, how did she know what she wanted to hear?
Yeah, how did she know to try that tuning and put the capo there? Because it's absolute genius, and it's so simple to play if you know that.
And it's all call coming through, which I'd have to ignore probably.
Yeah, you can take it. I can edit it out. That's still recording. I was saying about Joni Mitchell and Yellow Taxi and the genius behind that. And I was just interested whether there were... This is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot, about different music scenes. And I was just wondering whether there was a particular scene that influenced you. And she was part of they called it the Laurel Canyon scene. Like Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young and Joni Mitchell. Who else would have been in it? James Taylor.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, all of this.
Maybe Carol. I don't know about Carole King, but I sort of. Yeah.
So I mean, was this American West Coast? It's not really West Coast. It was kind of like Laurel Canyon. But that sound, those songwriters.
Not especially for me. No. I mean, I think I did like Crosby, Stills and Nash, but although I've grown to absolutely revere Joni.
Yeah,
I wasn't particularly into her at the time of Big Yellow Taxi or her early stuff. I didn't particularly grab me. I think possibly once she started working with, for instance, Jaco Pastorius.
Yeah, so the more jazz stuff.
One of the great electric bass players.
Yeah.
That certainly. I was listening out, I heard that, and thought, well.
That's something, yeah.
Yeah, she made some very good records with Jaco, especially Hegira and I think.
Yeah,
a couple of others.
So this question of, I'm getting a bit croaky. I think I need a bit of water.
You need a little
drink. If I was going to say, if you want some water, there's some there for you as well.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks.
this whole thing about notation and theory. When did you start getting interested in that? And just a bit about your own songwriting, because you're a songwriter as well. You're not just a bass player, yeah?
I am. I have been.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's a really interesting question about notation and arguably just study generally. I was going to say that music is so volatile, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, it's you pluck a note, you know, or you play or you perform, or you, like we were saying, you know, a performance is often a one-off, never to be repeated. So music is incredibly volatile. At least say with painting, when you paint, you put marks on a canvas and it's there.
Yeah.
You know, you've got it forever. But music, you play a note and once it's gone, it just dies. And unless you've recorded it, it's gone. Or a performance, or an idea, or a song, or whatever you're.
Yeah.
And so for me, studying theory and notation is a way of kind of pinning it down, you know, sort of getting a handle on it, something that is so ephemeral and just kind of, you know, disappears into the ether.
So that it can be recorded in written form.
Exactly. So I could sort of have an idea and come back to it, and, you know, because often you think, oh, I'll remember that forever, you know, and sometimes you do, but sometimes you don't. Or even years later, you know, you probably wouldn't have much chance of remembering it. Whereas I could go to an idea that I jotted down of just some notes. And essentially music notation is a simple thing in the sense, especially that I think most people can get their heads around the idea of notes going from low to high on a piano, the left hand, you know, just going in sequence up in semitones from a low right up to high. And so that bit is kind of quite easily represented on a music stave. Yeah. It's, in a way, I think what people struggle with is more how it breaks down rhythmically. But again, essentially, it is simple. You know, it's a sort of... often music is in 4/4, not always, is it? But probably largely in 4/4. And so you can either just... If you've got a time going of just 1, 2, 3, 4, you can have a note... 3, 4, or you could have 2 notes in a bar, da, da, or you could have 4, da, 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 or 8, da, 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 da. You can break it down in all those different ways. Yeah. And that way, for me, with the combination of the pitch and the note values, you know, you've got a way of pinning it down. You know, something that, an idea you had in the middle of the night, all right, if you can record it on your phone, great, or whatever. There's other ways of doing it. But if you haven't got that, you know, for people who are used to notation, they'll jot down an idea. And, you know, it's a way of... And then once you're in, say, the arranging phase, or you've kind of got maybe a verse, and maybe you repeat the verse, and then maybe you have a chorus or a bridge or a... But then, you know, to sort of, to even think further in terms of how the different ways you could arrange it, then obviously notation and theory can help you in that regard, you know.
So, okay, I think, again, I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think that you actually taught some of this stuff as well. You were teaching...
Well, it's funny when you said about there's all these shortcuts online, and I've got nothing against shortcuts. I'm all for shortcuts. You know, who needs to? You know, I was always, if I did teach for 20 years, and I'd always want to get people playing, and if you can give them things that help them, got no problem with that at all.
I think what I was trying to say is I don't believe that those shortcuts exist.
Well,
I think that they're kind of like snake oil. There are people on there.
Well, they are ads, aren't they? Those ones on YouTube, which of course we all see all the time. Especially if you're musicians, they quickly suss that out, don't they, and target you with them. But no, I wouldn't. I think there are some shortcuts which, you know, I might have taken years to discover. Yeah. But you know, if someone can show it to you, maybe that's useful. If I can show it to you in half an hour or even less, say building chords off a major scale, you know, it can be useful. It could be a straitjacket. It's not necessarily useful, but, you know, sometimes I think Yeah, short. I've got nothing against shortcuts if they, like you say, there's an element of snake oil probably in those ads. Yeah, yeah.
Have you got? Let me think of. Have you got any kind of like insights or like tricks that you picked up that you might want to share from when you were teaching?
One thing I would say, Nick, and it was actually from before I was a teacher, but for me, the MIDI system where you can have sounds in a module or a sampler, and then you can apply different musical information to it. For instance, how long the notes last, or how you combine them. So the strictly musical information, and then say the sound producing aspects, which comes from inside a box, right?
Yeah.
You know, you could have the sound of a drum or a string quartet or a trumpet or whatever it might be, and just you've got your musical information on your sequencer, or in my case, it was Notator, C-Lab Notator, became Logic really, and you can play that back with a piano sound or a string sound or whatever, and so that was quite an eye-opener for me to think that you've got that sort of sonic, the different sounds that are available, obviously from just actually playing a real instrument, but once MIDI came along, you've got a whole load of sounds in a box, haven't you? Effectively, that you can access, and that you can apply those different sort of your musical ideas to them. That was, and also to be able to see it on screen, to say, you can press go and it'll play your 4 crotchets. You can see them on the screen. You've written that 4 crotchets, that 3, 4, and it'll play them back to you. Yeah. And that was that really sort of was a light bulb moment for me. So I would encourage people, if you have got any interest in studying theory, use all this technology that we've got available, I mean, and I'd include all the YouTube stuff, all those fantastic tutorials and stuff. I mean, the hard part is sifting it, isn't it? Because there's just so much of it,
Yeah.
But all those Rick Beato things and stuff like that, I think you mentioned. I mean, he's brilliant, isn't he?
Yeah,
breaking down
really,
a track
really
and why is this really so good? Why is this solo so good? And he'll break it down and analyse it. And for me, that's great.
I have to say that I think probably the reason why Rick Beato is so good at doing that is because he studied.
Absolutely,
and he also
deep,
did ear training as well, so he can hear
training.
It. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I always say as a bass player, I'm not. I've never really had to deal with that too much. But of course, ear training is basic for playing with other people. I mean, when we have a conversation, we're listening and responding, aren't we? And playing music essentially with other people is the same thing. First, you agree on maybe a tuning. Everybody gets in tune, and then maybe you have a beat, so you can synchronise to in that way. But then essentially, it's about listening to each other and having some.
So is that? I mean, if you were, do you want to say a little bit about the teaching that you were doing? What kind of teaching?
Yes, I had young children at the time. I was right at the beginning of this century, 21st century. And I needed, I was still playing. I was doing gigs and stuff with different bands. But teaching is good because regular income and it's more sociable hours. It's not you're not out all night and everything. And then I saw an ad for an organisation called Access to Music that offered to take experienced musicians and give you an insight into how to teach.
Okay.
And that was really good for me. It was just there were some classroom sessions. They brought in some workshop where you'd have different tutors coming in running workshops, how maybe having a graphic score that everybody had to react to, or just practicing on singing all together.
And what did you teach? What element of music did you teach? Or?
Well, essentially, and then I just wanted to be able to do one-to-one lessons on bass guitar, really.
Okay.
But then that organisation, Access to Music, who are a music training organisation, they were based in Leicester. They're good. They've done a lot of stuff. I think it's changed now quite a bit. But at that time, they ran BTEC courses in popular music in Colchester Institute, which was fairly near where I was living. It was still a bit of a trek. But they were looking for a bass tutor for these courses, which they were running, because even though they were using the premises of Colchester Institute, they actually designed and ran the courses and hired and interviewed me and eventually ended up hiring me.
Yeah.
I mean, it didn't do any harm that I'd already done a course with them to be a so-called music facilitator, which is just a way of encouraging people to get involved in making music.
And was it teenagers or adults that you were teaching?
So in Colchester Institute, they're mostly, teenagers, young, mostly guys, I have to say, some girls, but overwhelmingly young guys. So I did some during that training. I was understudy a music teacher in a school, and that was a real eye opener for me. To be a music teacher in a school. I mean, schools are just so chaotic, aren't they? It's like as soon as they let the kids in, it's total mayhem sort of thing. But then it's a good challenge to kind of get everybody involved in doing something and maybe even learning something. And that was really interesting. But then once I got this job in Colchester Institute, I was doing mostly one-to-one lessons on bass guitar. And I'd always technique and chops, and of course, are important. But I also wanted just to always get across the elements of music that apply to any instrument that you're playing. So it's like about tuning and, if you're playing time, then how to play accurately and how different ways that you could do things. So trying to sort of, stimulate people's creativity. And my thing was always, I don't feel I've got lots of technique on bass. I mean, I've been playing a long time, so I guess I can get around. I know my way around and I've got knowledge, but I haven't got a huge amount of technique. And so that was not, but I always wanted as a teacher to encourage students' own creativity and also just to find out what they wanted to do. If you want to learn to play really good covers band, fine, no problem. I've got, it doesn't have to be esoteric, creative jazz. I love all kinds of music making, and especially from an employment point of view. You have to be, as you sure know, Nick, you have to be versatile, don't you? Like what you're doing now, it brings in music, but it also brings in your presenting skills and your technical skills, so you have to be versatile. So maybe a student, he couldn't make a living maybe as a musician, maybe he had some covers gigs or whatever, but maybe he could get a job as a sound engineer or as a teacher, So, you have to, and so that was something that I was focused on, trying to give people quite broad skills, not too narrow focused on being a really hotshot bass player, Of course, I love to hear that as well, but not only that,
And did you teach theory as well to these students?
So I brought that in. I tended to bring it in terms of even something simple like, and I realised it was quite good for me. I had to sort of, for a start, stuff like concepts like arpeggios and scales, to me, like they didn't mean, I hadn't even thought about them before. But then when I'm teaching at sort of A level and degree level, I think, well, I really need to know this stuff. And so, and plus generate some resources that would illustrate what I was talking about. So for instance, for an arpeggio, I'd have dots and I'd have tab as well. Yeah. I've got no problem with tab. If people want to use tab, to me, that's it's been used for years and years since really Baroque times.
I think this is.
This is.
Yeah, I think that this is, for me, this is quite an interesting thing. Is that when I was studying music, when I first started studying it, I had no idea that there were many different systems of notating. Mm-hmm. and there's so many different. I'm not even sure if I can dredge up these names now. The one that keeps on coming into my head is it's a composer called Varese or Varese.
Oh, Varese, yeah.
And
I think French guy.
a lot of his scores. Maybe I've got the wrong guy. So
I think he was Zappa referenced him a lot, I believe. Varese.
Yeah, I might have got totally the wrong guy. So if I have got the wrong guy, I'm sorry. But basically, when you looked at his scores, a lot of them were drawings.
Yeah,
They were. There was no notes as such or staves, but they were drawings and diagrams and
sometimes called graphic scores, maybe almost
exactly.
like pictures, as you say.
Yeah, and they're beautiful. And they really, it takes a little bit of time to focus in and understand what the composer was trying to communicate. But they do a really, really good job. So it's not, and also. If maybe I don't fully understand this, but I know that like tabla players, they have to learn an oral.
Absolutely, it's an oral tradition.
Tradition. It's not written down at all.
Which, of course, many musics are.
Yeah, and so they can actually tell you. They can tell you what they're going to play orally. Okay, so
they can talk about a particular rhythm or a particular scale, can't they? Same with flamenco to some extent, isn't it? You know,
which is is such a vast topic. But so, is there a particular kind of like piece of advice that you would give to someone? Because what it was I was trying to get to here is that I know. From personal experience, I don't think this is individual to me. I think that lots of people have this experience that when you're in a recording situation or when you're with a bunch of musicians and you're writing a piece of music, you're writing a song, you've got endless attempts to get it right. Yeah. And you can come back the next day, and replace everything that you did the day before. And so there isn't so much necessity or focus on virtuosity. But if you're playing live, it's a completely different. So, do you think that there's a way that you can get a balance between these two things?
Well, it's interesting what you said about when you're rehearsing or writing a song together. For a start, the hard thing sometimes is what are we trying to, what is the desired end product here? What can we even get a shape of an arrangement? How long is it going to be? How are we going to repeat bits? The beauty for me of, and I must say, it's a work in progress. Very few people come along with a complete score and say, right, give it this. And for a start, you need obviously musicians that can read it and play it, but just come in with something complete and say, this is it, do that, don't change anything, just play what I've written. Usually we're working with other people, bouncing ideas around. But then for me, on a most basic level, it would be interesting to say, well, look, okay, we've got some nice parts here, let's try and come up with an overall arrangement that's going to last, say, 6 minutes or whatever it is, or not even think of how long it's going to be. But you usually would have an idea of how roughly anything longer than 4 minutes is probably a bit too long for a single song. So
too much for one serving.
Yeah. So what are we trying to do here? And then not only that, I kind of come to the beauty of notation is that it's wrong or it's right. If you've written something down and you play it, within reason, obviously there could be sort of imperfections and interpretation and nuance, but essentially you've got something to discuss.
Yeah.
It's a bit like words. If you write a statement down, then you've got something to discuss. But usually conversations are not like that, are they? They're usually, you've got all these different possibilities and concepts. But I like the fact that, again, as I was saying earlier, it's stuff that you can pin down almost and repeat and come back to and recreate.
I know that this has been one of the most difficult things for me recently is that, again, from my background, playing with other musicians, it's been band rehearsals for gigs. So you go to a rehearsal and someone, it's not necessarily me, but you know, like someone has got an idea and they've exactly what you're saying. They've brought it. It's either a recording or it's a piece of paper, and you focus in on that idea and you work something out. And then you play a gig and you do a version of that thing that you've been practicing. But going along to these live sessions, which have been improvisations, you know, like this, okay, I'm exaggerating when I say it like this, but, you know, like my panic levels kind of like go quite high when I get there because no one's putting anything on the table.
No, it's very...
Yeah, no one's saying, okay, listen, we're going to work with this key or these 4 chords.
Indeed.
People just start playing, and you're either in, or you either get into it or you're not. And it's incredible. It's a completely different kind of like way of working. So. Is this also something that you taught? Did you teach performance or people how to deal with these live situations?
I think I tended to focus. It was more on the instrument itself and getting and having an instrument in hand and if I illustrated something, I try and play it, and then, you know, so. They did other on the sort of performance side. There was lots of other people had input into that.
Okay.
In the situation I was in a college, you know, of course you've got people who are focused more on performance and how maybe, you know, all that very complicated, you know, stuff that you could get into, or not complicated, but just good basic preparation, good. Basic tips for sort of having a good result, which is often just down to preparation, isn't it? You know, and knowing what you want to do. So I didn't tend to get so much into that, and I was just thinking. I think even though I like notation, and I wouldn't say I'm really a reading. I'm not someone who's focused or even all the music I play, it hasn't really been in that category. I've used notation to arrange things, especially as I was saying, using MIDI in that way, so that you can put whole arrangement into the sequencer and play along to that. You know, so often it's about combining perhaps sequenced material, might be a drum machine, but it could also include pitch stuff, keyboards, whatever, and then playing like bass to it, maybe singing to it, maybe playing guitar to it as well. So, you know, so the combination of those two things. But I wouldn't say I'm not someone. No, I'm very at home in a sense with, you know, like as you were describing. Like you, I have trepidation about that. Yeah. Well, what key are we in, and what, you know, what's. And in England, I play in more of a contemporary jazz group, and we tend to play well-known standards, which is kind of great, but in a sense, because it gives you something that you can all make a sound and it sounds pretty good straight away. But then all in another way, it's a bit of a straitjacket. You can't get away from that, you know. It's a bit. So I think a lot of what improvisers are looking for is sort of just freedom, really, isn't it? You know. Yeah.
So,
but that's scary.
Yeah, it is. It is scary.
You know.
I'm just thinking this through. We kind of. In the first part of this talk, we kind of finished up in the middle of the 70s, and then we picked up. You were saying that at the beginning of the noughties, the beginning of the 21st century teaching, but if I understood it correctly, all the way from the 70s up until quite recently, you were in bands that were touring. In Europe, in Northern Europe, you were from time to time recording. I don't know whether it was from time to time, but you certainly were doing some recording as well.
Yeah, well, up to a point. I mean, it was. I don't really feel I had a. You know what it's like when you're in the middle of it. You're not. It's not clear to you what you are doing always. Yeah. Which I think was of weakness of mine. I should have been better at looking ahead and sort of but I tended to sort of go with the flow a lot. So, in fact, I didn't tour that much. I tended to play more in local bands.
Okay.
You know, I would say I did a couple of tours. I did one quite big tour.
Yeah.
With a guy called David Thomas, who was the singer in Perubu, and he put together a group, including some members of Henry Cow, and we did a big tour.
I'm just wondering about this. I think maybe I've got this completely wrong, but you'll be able to tell me straight away. I met a guy called Dave Thomas, and he was
on the South Coast. He's an American guy, right?
He was the Dave Thomas that I met. He was a record company executive, but he was also known as a rock musician. And he was it was in Trident Studios in Wardour Street in London, and he was working in the offices there. He had long blonde hair.
No,
different guy. Different guy. Okay.
I think what I've done is very much a combination of I got into songwriting, and then when I got into MIDI, that helped me to arrange it in new ways, and I love doing that. But then I was just working as a bass player, doing cabaret bands, maybe some jazz, maybe some more original projects. But what I did struggle to was to pull everything together into one thing. I had short-lived bands that were doing the stuff I'd written. I was living with a woman who was a very good piano player, and we had a group together, and we played all our own stuff, and that was a good chance to get out and play our own material. And occasionally that's happened. I had a long-standing group with some very good Dutch friends called the Relatives, with my colleague Mark Hadley, who's a British guy, a very good all-rounder, so I've occasionally had sort of vehicles for what I was writing, but it's tended to be quite separate, and I've never felt that I successfully brought them all together. As a bass player, I was singing my own tunes. I was writing tunes with melodies, and you probably know what it's like when you're sitting at home singing and accompanying it. Is fine, but to actually go and take it out on stage and play bass at the same time is another ask. And so I always struggle. I found that a bit of a struggle. I mean, someone like McCartney or Sting, even those guys, I think you really have to work at transferring what you've written, your song, to performing it on stage, on a big stage. And maybe play bass and sing at the time is quite an art in itself.
But I think that's another advert for don't take the snake oil, do the hard work, because McCartney and Sting, as far as I know, I mean, I've never actually spoken to them about it, but from what I can see and what I've read, they really, really worked hard on their technique, and they really worked hard on theory and
everything. Both of them, of course, brilliant songwriters, up there with anybody, aren't they? In my opinion.
So I don't, it's kind of like I don't think there are shortcuts for that kind of thing. I think you have to put the work in.
I mean, Paul McCartney's apprenticeship was being in the Beatles, really, wasn't it?
I often wonder about that.
Talk about learning on the job, making records.
I think this is going to sound terrible because it just, at this moment in time, I can't remember the name of their producer.
George Martin.
Sir George Martin, yeah. I think that Paul McCartney's apprenticeship was with George Martin.
Absolutely.
Yeah, not the Beatles. I think the Beatles was the vehicle that he did it, but
they were just perfect for each other, weren't they?
Yeah.
To have that combination of skills. Yeah. The Beatles as a whole, plus George Martin, I would say. Yeah. But, McCartney, arguably, as a bass player and as a songwriter, Lennon and McCartney, well.
But did okay, so you're talking about songwriting and bands that you were playing in locally and some tours. Was it music business? Did you have contracts or? Again,
Nick, I would say that, and I always said that to my students. It's important to build up relationships with business people. But when I grew up, it was almost taboo. It was like, oh, what are you doing, man? You're selling out by sort of signing a record deal with no, come on. If you want to, if you're serious about what you want to do, then you have to work with those people. To to not do it as I did, it really more or less cuts off that possibility, you know. And that I wish, and so I think it is important to say that. Don't be sniffy, if you like, or say that, or, you know. And I think people maybe have a different attitude these days. I think it maybe was something that was around a bit more when I was, you know, in my 20s and 30s. It was like, you know, you had to be pure and sort of, you know.
But it's funny you say that because going back, we're going back in time a bit now. Again, this is all stuff that I've picked up from reading. I've never had a conversation with these guys personally, but Pink Floyd, it seemed like the members of Pink Floyd, they were really switched on to business.
Absolutely. Arguably, with the exception of Syd, I would say.
Yeah.
And I don't think it necessarily was even deliberate on his part. He just simply didn't twig it, you know, didn't get it.
But you were saying that it was kind of like taboo back then. But I mean,
I think it was really. I mean, Floyd were an absolute they did it the right way. They got a manager. They signed. They got a record deal. They just, you know, so that they had all the sort of the mechanism.
The other thing that I think that again, I'm not really too much up on the history of this, but I think another thing that set them apart was that they not only had a manager, they had a tour manager, a permanent tour manager.
They must have.
And they were really focused on...
They had people they worked with. I know Jenny's told me that they had long-standing people, including like Storm Thorgerson, I think, who designed their albums, but also had a big part to play in their live presentations. They're light people they work with.
Exactly. I was going to say their PA systems and their lighting and
sound guys. I'm sure they'd have had their
so you really
team.
I think you really need to have that kind of...
Of course you do.
Yeah.
You can't be sort of thinking, I'm not interested in any of that shit. That was more my attitude, and I think, you know, if anything, it's been held me back.
Okay.
I would.
So, what do you think the future holds for musicians? You got any thoughts about that?
I know you've spoken about your concern about AI. I
don't think I've got a concern about it. I think...
If anything, you were saying perhaps more, you were perceiving some advantages to it. And I wouldn't disagree with that viewpoint. I mean, I think, as I've describing before, say, with using sequencers, MIDI, even a drum machine, I mean, that's kind of AI, isn't it? You know, you're getting a machine to lay down something that you can respond to and work with and change if you want to. So, you know, we're already using it to a large extent, you know. So just to put that to bed, I don't have too much of a concern on that side. I hear what you're saying, that, and of course there's the possibility for famous people to have their work sort of, you know, or their voice even used in a context that, you know, in another way. So that is, I can see that is a worry. I mean, you know, that recent case with Ed Sheeran, you know, I sort of saw both sides of it a bit. And on one level, I think it can be easy to write in a very derivative way. If you use a very standard chord sequence, then it probably is going to sound quite a lot of other things that people have already used, that, you know, written using that sequence. So, but on the other hand, what you do with even a simple chord sequence, you know, to hear a Ray Charles or a Marvin Gaye to sing on a tune like Let's Get It On, well, he just brings all that artistry that, you know, you just can't even conceive of, where it's something he's learned and absorbed in the tradition, you know. So you're bringing a whole lot of other stuff that actually is what really makes it special, you know.
I think that it's such a vast topic.
It is.
I honestly don't know if I can summarise what it is that I think. It's so difficult to kind of like draw all of the strands. I think that the overarching feeling that I have is that it's a piece of technology a bit like the printing press. It's going to totally change the way people approach creativity, and I think that's an amazing thing. I think some bad things will come out of it, and I think some good things will come out of it. I think really what fascinates me about it is that, okay, so you were saying, we were talking about Pink Floyd and the business aspect of the let's say the music industry and how they played the game and they had managers and all the rest of it. So I think that AI is going to be a game changer, and I'll tell you why. I think I can put into a sentence or two. Okay, so and people can check this out. It's very, very, very simple to check out if what I'm saying has got any element of truth or fact to it. If you go onto YouTube and do some searches, you'll be able to find this. But so, for example, there's AISIS, which is basically a band.
Oh, yeah.
They've worked on their sound and they're real players and they sound like Oasis, but they're using AI to put Liam Gallagher's voice onto, and they're calling it like the lost Oasis tracks, like the lost recordings. And not only does the AI sound like Liam Gallagher, but it phrases like him. It's incredible. It's really quite incredible. The other famous one, or not famous ones, but because this has only been a thing for a month or two. It's it's only something that we're talking about a couple of months. There's Drake and The Weeknd. This is another one where someone's put out a version of one of Drake's songs, and the AI sounds better than Drake.
Right. Yeah.
It sounds really, really, really good. Yeah. And then there's this artist called Grimes, who is basically Elon Musk's ex. As far as I know, from what I can tell, they're still on very good terms. They've got kids. They're just not together anymore. But she has come up with an app that allows people to use her voice on their recordings. So you come up with a recording of your song and you put your song
with her voice. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is quite interesting.
So that's the point that I wanted to make with that is that it sounds amazing. And the other point that I was going to make is that if you look, I said I was going to do it in one or two sentences. I've gone on a bit too long. But if you look at the kind of like chain in the music industry, it was artist, record company, distribution, and then the end of the chain would be the listener, the fan, the consumer, whatever you want to call them. So the record company couldn't exist without an artist. So the record companies are probably jumping up and down now because they don't need artists.
Maybe.
Yeah, they don't. The artists are kind of like they're not necessarily needed because AI can do their job. But what I would find, if we could like go forward 2 or 3 or 4, 5 years into the future, distribution networks like Spotify, they don't need record companies anymore. Because if they come up with a department within Spotify that creates AI, I don't know, made, not created, but made music, they don't need the record companies or the artists.
For me, I think what you're missing out, Nick, a bit is the element of human creativity. I just struggle to believe that AI, because what you're describing is someone really exploiting what someone has already done in almost really just for commercial purposes, for money-making purposes largely. It would seem there's not any artistic impulse, there's no new idea about, how human beings relate to it. There's no, I suppose it does.
I think this is the phenomenal thing. This is why I say to people, have a look on YouTube, because, okay, I can't remember which way around this is, but I think that Drake's song, the AI version, has had more listens than the real version.
Well, that is going to be a powerful incentive for people, the commercial, the ability to rake in the cash. Of course it is.
Yeah.
But, I think we've already come up against this problem in a way where you had companies like Sony and Warner Inc. or something in the end, or not so much Sony, but the streaming companies, they're saying, well, now we've got these mechanisms for distributing music. So, as you say, why should we bother with, independent labels? We'll just have our own creators in-house. And they've already done that, haven't they? On Amazon and Netflix. That's the model for Netflix, isn't it? You rather than we're just going to make our own content. And Sony, they had the technology to distribute it, but so now, well, we might as well sign up the creators, so keep it all in-house.
Yeah.
But I still personally think you're going to need, I can't see that far into the future, and at my age, you only want to look, well, it's not that I don't want to look ahead, I do want to look ahead, but I know that I won't be around to sort of see it beyond a certain point. Yeah. But I do struggle to believe that, it's a bit like, I think the very first almost example of it was in the film 2001, where the computer he decides he's going to take over the spaceship, and this, to me, it would be a concern. It feels like, the machine has taken over the direction. Machines are great, but you want to have a human being telling it what to do. I don't want the machine making those decisions for me. So that's my sort of, it's not just an ethical concern. It's not even, it's more just a sort of, I just cannot really believe that you could supplant human creativity ultimately.
Okay.
I struggle to believe that, but it might be just my age.
I think that's a really good note to.
It is, isn't it?
To end this on.
Thank you so much, Nick.
Is there anything else that you wanted to add? Is there any kind of is there a website that people could go to listen to your stuff that you'd like to mention?
Well, I will mention, because I've got some free tracks up on Number One Music.
So what's that? Number1.com? Or?
Yes, N1M.com, I think, is the shorthand for it. For the website. It's an American company. I made a record with the Relatives a few years ago that is on, I think it's on all the major streaming platforms. I think it's on Apple.
So if they go to n1m.com and search for...
Jack Monck.
Okay.
Otherwise, you'd have to search for Phil Miller plus the Relatives, I think, or Relatives plus Phil Miller. Yeah. Will bring up that record, which I'm proud of. It's got some good stuff on it. It's a CD. Yeah. An old-fashioned concept, but...
do you want to explain what a CD is?
No, because and like vinyl's having a massive comeback, isn't it? I've recently got into this artist called Billy Bottle, who I met and I love, and she's just got a new record out, and they put it out on vinyl. I don't know if I need to ask her if they put it out on CD as well, because I don't have a deck, a record deck.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nick.
And I hope we can do this again sometime.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay.